So I was haunted by why on a human level does such a thing happen? You know, what is that dark side that Dick Cheney talks about? Now, taxi to the dark side, is, as many of you may know, was something that Dick Cheney said we were going to have to go over to about a week after 9/11. He told Tim Russert we're going to have to go over to the dark side. So what was it on a human level that would allow such depravity? But also, why did our policymakers pursue it? As it turns out, much of what happened in the field, in Abu Ghraib and Bagram and other places, was not often the result of precise policy, though sometimes, as in the case of Guantanamo, it was. It was often a mixture of removing previous prohibitions on mistreatment, like the Geneva Conventions, and creating a kind of fog of ambiguity, and at the same time administering tremendous pressure to the people down at the bottom. And the question was, and that's why you see at the end this issue of all these guys being convicted of crimes while the policymakers at the top are pretty much let off the hook. But why did our policymakers try so hard to create an environment in which the gloves were off, in which the rules didn't apply, particularly when our policymakers knew or could have found out from all of their military advisors that there's a good reason why this stuff doesn't happen, that there's a good reason why there are rules against this stuff, and that by and large torture or coercive interrogation technique does not yield good information. So it was that question of why that haunted me. And what I went to do was to see it from the bottom to the top. And with the soldiers, I learned that there is a kind of, one of the reasons that the military has these rules is that there is what the military calls force drift. Without these rules and guidance, if you're interrogating a prisoner and you're motivated to ratchet up the mistreatment, and that person doesn't answer you, you'll push it further and further and further and further and further. Also, the other thing I discovered was that these guys, there was a kind of perception that it was okay to do this stuff out there. We have our Constitution to protect us here. It was okay to do that stuff out there. But the fact of the matter was, these people who were being encouraged to mistreat prisoners and others were bringing their torment back here in ways that were also beginning to infect the body politic. And last, as far as the soldiers went, and it was haunting for me to talk to these people because I was not initially sympathetic, because they were these were people, after all, who murdered a young man collectively, these military police at Bagram. But they were scapegoated, and they were haunted by the fact that they had been driven by appeals to their patriotism to mistreat these prisoners and by superior officers, and yet somehow the superior officers weren't even being investigated, much less indicted. This led me up the chain to the civilian administration, and one of the things that I found most interesting about this whole process was that there was a kind of fiddling with the law, an attempt to redefine torture, as you saw from Mr. Gonzalez, who's always trying to parse the words, as many of the administration were trying to do. And there was a kind of ignorant embracing, an ignorance of history and an ignorant embracing of techniques which were originally designed by the Soviets and the Chinese communists not to obtain actionable intelligence, but to obtain false confessions. So we have a policy that is now getting intelligence, but the intelligence is actually, the means used are actually means that are best suited to obtain false confessions. Not the truth, but false confessions. Where this ultimately led, and it wasn't something that I initially thought about at the beginning, was that what's happening here is that there is a weird feedback loop and mechanism where the administrators at the top, and I'm talking about Dick Cheney primarily, and also David Addington, his key aide, and John Yoo and many others, they become more and more comfortable with the system because it just happens to reinforce their views about the war on terror. And a classic example is the interrogation of a man named Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, who was a man who was captured and begun to be interrogated by the FBI. Good, actionable intelligence was being obtained, but it wasn't the kind of information that the Bush administration wanted to hear. They sent the CIA in, CIA took over, he was rendered to Egypt where he was tortured and waterboarded, and lo and behold, he came out with information that revealed that there was a direct connection between al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. This information was used by Colin Powell in his address to the United Nations as a way of prefiguring the war in Iraq, sending us toward that war. Yet a year later, the CIA recanted the testimony of Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, and so we now realize that what he told us was absolutely false, but it happened to feed directly into what the administration wanted to hear. So this, it seems to me, takes us directly to what Orwell talked about 1984, where you have the executive branch assuming enormous power to mistreat people in order to obtain the intelligence that undergirds their political power. And they're aided in this by a Congress that is complacent and a public that, it turns out, 35% of which believes in the efficacy of torture in some way, shape, or form. And so actually the Bush administration begins to campaign on this. So this was the educational process for me, and it's what led ultimately to my making the film. And it's why this issue, I think, is so important about democracy. Ongoing, though, I will also tell you that the resistance to this subject, because it's very difficult, I think, for all of us to engage this, because I think to some extent we're all complicit, because we've allowed this to happen. So the film itself had difficulty getting out, and indeed it was hobbled by a number of forces, a network that first bought it and then refused to show it, the MPAA, which refused to allow us to show certain images. But over time, we were able to win a number of awards and begin to break through. And I hope in the future we will continue to do that. But one of the things that was very satisfying to me from a filmmaking standpoint was that we tried very hard in the filmmaking of this not to approach this by talking to a number of recognized and predictable human rights activists, but to talk to people who are inside the system, who through their conscience felt great discomfort. You saw a number of them here at the end. And the result has been that the military, of all places, has warmly embraced this film, so much so that now this is being taught as it's required viewing for the Army JAG School. And so as a filmmaker and as somebody who is interested also in social change, the challenge remains for us in the future to continue to find these unconventional distribution mechanisms and community groups that will continue to allow this film to reverberate, so that hopefully will provoke more questions in the future. And that seems to be succeeding. The film will be on HBO this fall, and we're going to engage more and more with community groups, and that's in order to be able to allow that message to reverberate and hook people up with the kind of tools that they need to have in order to be able to insist on the one thing that I'm nervous about going forward, which is a full investigation of what's happened in order to be able to embrace the future and reconnect with a sense of reconnect with our own prior reputation throughout the world as a place that safeguards human rights. We have to show the world that we're able and willing to investigate what's been done in our name, and that remains the challenge for the future. Anyway, thank you very much.